Eugenics, the study of how to arrange reproduction within a human population to increase the occurrence of heritable characteristics regarded as desirable. That comes from the Oxford Languages Dictionary. Today we're going to take a look back in history to pre-World War II times when eugenics was in the forefront in Nazi Germany. Or was that the only place? The other countries you might expect such atrocities from might be communist ones like China, North Korea, and of course, Nazi Germany in World War II. However, would it surprise you if I mentioned that Australia, Brazil, Japan, Singapore, Sweden, the UK, Canada, and even the United States were involved? Hi, and welcome to Finding the Facts with Dan. I'm Dan O'Brien, and we're going to discover a lesser taught history lesson regarding eugenics, the sterilization of humans to improve the genetic quality of the population. In my last video, I covered the WEF, the World Economic Forum, with a brief history in which I highlighted Nazi Germany in 1938, where sterilizations were the norm and began heavily in Klaus Schwab's hometown of Ravensburg. When I began to research that, I ran into some information that I had not been taught in school. Eugenics was not unique to the Nazis. A criticism of eugenics policies is that regardless of whether negative or positive policies are used, they are susceptible to abuse because genetic selection criteria determined by whichever group has the political power at the time. Furthermore, many criticize negative eugenics as a violation of basic human rights, seen since 1968's Proclamation of Tehran as including the right to reproduce. Another criticism is that eugenics policies eventually lead to a loss of genetic diversity, thereby resulting in interbreeding depression due to a loss of genetic variation. Yet another criticism of contemporary eugenics is that they propose to disrupt millions of years of human evolution permanently and artificially, and that attempting to create genetic lines of a clean of disorders can have far-reaching ancillary downstream effects in the genetic ecology, including negative effects on immunity and on species resilience. We've all seen the effects of scientists meddling with nature. For example, cane toads. Cane toads were introduced to kill cane beetles that destroyed sugarcane fields. In 1935, 102 toads were introduced into a cane field in Australia, where they in turn wandered off, and their number now stands at over 1.5 billion. They now eat native plants voraciously. Not only that, but they excrete venom potent enough for one toad to kill a large crocodile, not to mention pets and humans. Surveys showed that if you kill 98 out of 100 toads, the remaining 2 can create 30,000 new spawn, and even if many tadpoles die, there will be 10 times as many toads in that area in a week. The toad now has shown up in the Caribbean, the Philippines, Fiji, New Guinea, and even the US. European starlings, another introduced species, were brought into North America to try and control insects. Their flock sizes often exceed 3,000, and they can decimate crops as they tend to feed on fruits and grains. They're also extremely aggressive to other species of birds, often stealing nests from them. Their invasion has also damaged infrastructure. We've all heard of the Africanized honeybees. The Africanized honeybees were bred with European honeybees to boost honey production. As you're aware, they're extremely aggressive, not only invading European hives and killing their queen, but they've also attacked humans, resulting in deaths. We could go on and on and on with the times that we humans have introduced species of both animals and plants to try and make life better or kill pests and make more money. These things never go in our favor. We also tend to go overboard with antibiotics and antibacterials. These have also caused a lowering in our natural immunity. Eugenics is no different. We again, as a human species, began to play Russian roulette with our future in the 1900s. We've all been taught about the Holocaust and Hitler's evil plan for a master race. We may have even learned in school that he attempted a slightly less evil plan, if there is such a thing, by sterilizing the less desirables. What we weren't taught is that it also took place in the rest of the free world, to include our own country as well as our neighbor to the north. Let's go back in history a little bit to see where some of the ideas came from. I'm sure you've heard of Charles Darwin. As you're aware, he published his book called The Origin of Species, which outlined his theory of evolution as well as the concept of natural selection. The argument was that over time, characteristics of a species would change based on the pressures of environment and increase the survivability of that species. We've seen that happen. Well, this is evident in both nature and even in things such as viruses that mutate to overcome resistance. His book struck a bit of fear with the elite at the time and those higher classes. They were hit with a feeling of desperation, being that they felt the unfit were having more children than the fit of society, thus the human race was doomed to deteriorate. The argument was also made that medicine, charity, and centralized government removed all struggle, further promoting the survival of the unfit. Darwin was a direct influence on his cousin, Sir Francis Galton, who coined the term eugenics and tried to establish that intelligence and talent were hereditary. Darwin's son, Leonard, was the president of the First International Congress of Eugenics. Another of his sons, George, promoted birth control among the lower classes and simplified the divorce process in an effort to limit their reproduction as well. Darwin died in 1882, but the ideas gleaned from his teachings lived on. In 1907, the Indiana legislature passed the first compulsory eugenic human sterilization law. Approved by Governor Hanley, the law made sterilization mandatory for what they called criminals, idiots, rapists, and imbeciles that were in state custody residing in state institutions such as the Fort Wayne State School for the Feeble-Minded. The legislation further outlined the procedure and conditions for sterilization. In order for a sterilization to take place, approval from a committee of experts made up of 2 surgeons and the managing board members of the institution had to be secured. The committee needed to assess the patient and decide that there was no probability of his or her mental improvement. If such a judgment was made, then a sterilization procedure could proceed. This legislation further outlined that surgeons were not to be compensated for the cost of performing a sterilization any more than $3, which is about the equivalent of $95 in today's money. Carrie Buck was born in Charlottesville, Virginia, the first of 3 children to be born to Emma Buck. She also had a half-sister, Doris Buck, and a half-brother, Roy Smith. Little is known about Emma except that she was poor and married to Frederick Buck, who abandoned her early in their marriage. At 17, Carrie became pregnant as a result of being raped by her foster mother's nephew, Clarence Garland. On January 23, 1924, the Dobbs had her committed to the Virginia colony for epileptics and the feeble-minded on the grounds of feeble-mindedness, that she was incorrigible, she was promiscuous, she was accused of immorality, prostitution, and having syphilis. Her commitment is said to have been based on the family's embarrassment at Buck's pregnancy from the rape incident. Carrie Elizabeth Buck was the plaintiff in United States Supreme Court case Buck v. Bell after having been ordered to undergo compulsory sterilization for purportedly being feeble-minded. The surgery, carried out while Carrie was an inmate of the Virginia State Colony for Epileptics and the Feeble-Minded, took place under the authority of the Sterilization Act of 1924, part of the Commonwealth of Virginia's eugenics program. In order to ensure that the Buck family could not reproduce, her sister Doris was also sterilized without consent when she was hospitalized for appendicitis. She later married, and after she and her husband attempted to have children, she didn't discover the reason for their lack of success until 1980. She died in a nursing home in 1983. In an 8-1 decision, the U.S. Supreme Court found that the Virginia Sterilization Act of 1924 did not violate the U.S. Constitution. Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote in his brief, "It is better for all the world if society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind, and that sterilization was justified to avoid society being swamped with incompetence." His decision set precedents, and more than 60,000 Americans were legally sterilized, as well as about 500,000 around the world. 33 states made involuntary sterilizations legal. Men were often sterilized due to aggression and deviance. Women were then sterilized to control the less desirables in society. Henry Goddard was a prominent psychologist, eugenicist, and segregationalist during the early 20th century. Goddard's famed Kallikak study of defectives persuaded more than 33 states to impose forced sterilization on the feeble-minded. He also tested arrivals at Ellis Island and found that 83% of the Jews, 80% of the Hungarians, and 79% of Italians were either morons or imbeciles. Certificates were issued. Historian Daniel Okrent documented American influence on Nazi race hygiene. As early as 1932, Walter Schultz of the Nazi euthanization program called on German geneticists to heed the example of the United States. Heed the example of the United States. So the Nazis were looking at us for what to do. The Nazi Handbook for Law and Legislation cited American immigration law as a model for Germany. Osborne complained that negative press about the Nazis resulted from Jewish influence. Perhaps paradoxically, it was the Nazi genocide that stigmatized eugenics forever. The Eugenics Society in Canada, or ESC, was established by Dr. William Hutton in 1930. Advocates of eugenic practices in Canada spanned a wide background, with prominent support emerging from academics and medical professionals. Figures from across the political spectrum came to embrace eugenic ideas, particularly in Western Canada, translating those ideas into laws and policies, such as the Sexual Sterilization Act of Alberta in 1928. In 1937, Alberta amended its Sexual Sterilization Act. It amended it to remove the need for informed consent for sterilization subjects who were considered feeble-minded. This amendment set Alberta apart from other jurisdictions throughout North America, which had added consent provisions. In 1942, however, Alberta changed this law again to move the eugenics program beyond the confines of institutions. As a result, more children were identified in the community at schools and through public health visits. Not until the early 1970s would the Sexual Sterilization Act be repealed under the rise of the progressive conservatives in Alberta. Developments in genetic, genomic, and reproductive technologies at the beginning of the 21st century have raised numerous questions regarding the ethical status of eugenics, effectively creating a resurgence of interest in the subject. Some, such as UC Berkeley sociologist Troy Duster, have argued that modern genetics is a backdoor to eugenics. This view was shared by then White House Assistant Director for Forensic Sciences, Tanya Simonicelli, who stated in a 2003 publication by the Population and Development Program at Hampshire College that advances in pre-implantation genetic diagnosis are moving society to a new era of eugenics, and that unlike the Nazi eugenics, modern eugenics is a consumer-driven and market-based, where children are increasingly regarded as made-to-order consumer products. In a 2008 newspaper article, Richard Dawkins said that discussion regarding eugenics was inhibited by the shadow of Nazi misuse to the extent that some scientists would not admit that breeding humans for certain abilities is at all possible. He believes that it is not physically different from breeding domestic animals for traits such as speed or herding skill. Dawkins felt that enough time had elapsed to at least ask what the ethical differences were between breeding for ability versus training athletes or forcing children to take music lessons, though he could think of persuasive reasons to draw the distinction. This modern trend back towards eugenics has risen much uncovered debate. The National Human Genome Research Institute says that eugenics is inaccurate, scientifically erroneous, and immoral. In October 2015, the United Nations International Bioethics Committee wrote that the ethical problems of human genetic engineering should not be confused with the ethical problems of 20th century eugenics movements. However, it is still problematic because it challenges the idea of human equality and opens up new forms of discrimination and stigmatization for those who do not want or cannot afford the technology. Some also argue that prenatal screening is a contemporary form of eugenics because it may lead to abortions of babies with undesirable traits. According to Jalpreet Verdi in an article in the New Internationalist, the practices of eugenics still occurred very recently in Canada. In 1972, the longest running and most aggressive sexual sterilization law in Canada was finally repealed. Even so, policies of sterilization still persisted, revived under the guise of family planning and targeting women and men declared incapable of responsible parenting. 60 Indigenous women are currently filing a class action lawsuit alleging forced sterilization dating back 30 years in Saskatchewan. Some of the sterilizations occurred as late as 2017. 2017. They are each claiming $7 million Canadian in damages. The women allege their fallopian tubes were tied without their consent or that they were pressured into undergoing the procedure by doctors and told that it was reversible. Some were pushed into signing consent forms while they were in active labor or on operating tables. These women were told that they could not leave until their tubes were tied or cauterized, or that they would not see their babies until they agreed. What Canada was doing was coercive sterilization, and that's recognized by the UN as a human rights violation. In short, it is cultural genocide against a marginalized group of people under the guises of settler colonialism, racism, and eugenics. More recently in Canada, a move towards more lenient euthanasia laws that they have may soon allow mature minors, as they like to refer to them as, or in our terms, 16 and 17-year-old teens to have medical assistance in dying, or MAID, MAID, as they try to cleanly refer to it. On March 17, 2021, Bill C-7 received royal assent. With the new law in place, the next step is parliamentary review committed to in the bill. You would think that if legalized, euthanasia would only be allowed for individuals who are suffering from an excruciating illness that limits their enjoyment of life, or those who can't find a cure and are facing a foreseeable death. Now, however, people in Canada who have been diagnosed with psychiatric disorders such as depression will soon have the option to voluntarily end their lives. This includes those over 16 and older to do so without parental consent. So your 16 or 17-year-old can have the government pay for their suicide, and you don't even get a say. I'm sad. Kill me. It even allows for parents to decide for those children between ages 12 and 15 if they feel that those children need to die because they're too depressed or whatever. Not that I agree, but if you support this and support abortion, then why not even include those under 12? Maybe that's just next. Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister of Canada, took office in 2015. So he took office in 2015, and some of these eugenic procedures were taking place 2 years after he took office. In early 2020, Trudeau brought forward a more liberal assisted death bill, which ultimately passed. That's what I just mentioned. Between 2016 and 2021, 31,664 assisted suicides occurred in Canada. The global average for self-harm deaths is 1.34%. In the same year, assisted suicides in Canada accounted for 1.89% of their total deaths. So assisted suicides were 1.89%, which is more than the world average for regular suicides. So Canadians must be very unhappy because they're just killing themselves all over the place. I probably would if Trudeau was in charge of my country too. So I could not find any specifics, but I would surmise that this number does not include assisted suicide. As you know, Canada has national health care. And to get information, all you got to do is dial 811. So just listen to this 811 recording made in Canada by Maxime Bernier. He's the leader of the People's Party of Canada.
Thank you for calling Healthline 811. If this is an emergency, please hang up and dial 911. The Saskatchewan Health Authority will not tolerate verbal abuse or abusive language. If you choose to use abusive language, it will result in a termination of the call. If you are looking to book an appointment for the flu or COVID vaccine, please go to www.forflu.ca or call the SaskVax booking line at 1-833-727-5829. Please listen carefully as our menu options have changed. Press 1 if your call is COVID-19 related. Press 2 if you wish to speak to a registered nurse for all other concerns. Press 3 if you wish to speak to a mental health and addictions clinician. Press 4 if you wish to speak to poison control. Press 5 if you wish to leave a message with the Medical Assistance in Dying program. If you are looking to press 1 to be transferred to poison control. Press 2 to leave a message with the Medical Assistance in Dying program. To return to the main menu. Hello, you have reached the confidential voicemail box of the Provincial Medical Assistance in Dying program with the Saskatchewan Health Authority. I'm sorry that we've missed your call. Please leave a detailed message and your call will be returned during our regular business hours, Monday to Friday, 8 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. If you are calling on a weekend, statutory holiday, or after regular business hours and you require immediate attention, please hang up and call Healthline 811 and select option number 2. Please let the RN know you are calling regarding MAID. If this is a medical emergency, please hang up and dial 911. Record your message at the tone when you If you are looking to...
It sounds so normal, doesn't it? Let's go another step further. Who's paying for this assisted suicide? The Canadian government. What did they not do too many years ago? Coerced sterilization. When will it become the government's choice? Trudeau also told people at a 2013 fundraiser pre-election was that the administration that he admired the most was the dictatorship of communist China. Yet these idiots to our north elected him. It kind of reminds me of what's going on in our country. If you've seen some previous videos, you know that I've been focusing on the World Economic Forum. There have been many stories floating around which may be conspiracy or may not be, that there is a plan by the WEF to reduce the global population. Trudeau is a main player in the WEF. Half of his cabinet are made up of young global leaders, a kind of starter section for the WEF. This could be pure coincidence, but I truly doubt it when you look at the totality of the evidence. Other young global leaders have included Mark Zuckerberg, founder and CEO of Facebook, Jagmeet Singh, leader of the New Democratic Party of Canada, Pete Buttigieg, the Secretary of Transportation in the Biden administration, another connection for the green push in transportation and elevation in fuel costs, and French President Emmanuel Macron, Leana Wen, the former president of Planned Parenthood. In 2017 interview, Schwab noted
names like Mrs. Merkel, even Vladimir Putin and so on, they all have been young global leaders of the World Economic Forum. Mm-hmm. But what we are very proud of now is the young generation, like Prime Minister Trudeau, President of Argentina and so on, that we penetrate the cabinets. We penetrate the cabinets. So yesterday I was at a reception for Prime Minister Trudeau, and I know that half of this cabinet, or even more half of this cabinet, are actually young global leaders of the World Economic Forum.
Need we say more? I think the takeaway is that we need to know more about our past so that we can avoid the same issues in the future. For some reason, we weren't taught this stuff in school. I think we also need to open our eyes to what is in front of us and stop burying our heads in the sand. The leadership in the world today is putting us on a collision course with disaster. Biden is an extremely dangerous president, as well as those who surround him. And the leader to the north, Trudeau, may be even more so dangerous. If you value life that you knew years ago, and if you value the life of your children in the future, For God's sake, educate yourself and vote not based on one little thing that you hear, but on the totality of everything that a leader stands for. Stay safe, everyone.